प्रेजेंटेड बाय ईबिक्स कैश, हर खुशी के लिए काफी है।
Hello and welcome to Business Today's special series in the run-up to Budget 2022. I'm Udayan Mukherjee. In this series, over the last few weeks, you've been hearing names like Dr. Kaushik Basu, Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, and today I have with me a distinguished economist and former Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, Dr. T. Subbarao. Subba, it's a pleasure to have you with me on the show, and thank you very much for joining in today. Let me begin by asking you about the core issue which starts off any discussion on the budget, which is the fiscal deficit. Because this time there seems to be two views on it. One view that because of the kind of scarring that we've seen from the pandemic, maybe the finance minister can take one more year of relaxation and not move towards the path of fiscal consolidation immediately in order to be growth supportive. The other view is that we've had a year of relaxation, tax revenues have picked up, the economy is recovering, and this is the moment where we should get back to the path of fiscal prudence once again. Which one would you lean towards?
Well, I'd lean towards the later view because the finance minister actually opted for a fiscal consolidation path in the last budget, which is more relaxed and much slower than people had expected. And the market had taken that in its stride. But I don't believe further relaxation would be advisable. I think it's very important for India and for the finance minister to establish credentials by staying with the fiscal consolidation path, which is already not very restrictive. So last year, fiscal deficit, she opted for about 6.8% of GDP. That might come around that level or slightly lower. I think this time the finance minister should stay around 6% of GDP. In fact, I would go a step further and say that she must also give a fiscal consolidation path to 4.5% of GDP by 2025-26, which is the path she had chosen. And I don't believe that, consolidating from 6.5% to 6% is going to be growth restrictive. If expenditure is restructured appropriately and if there is growth enhancing expenditure, I don't believe reducing fiscal deficit from 6.8% to 6.5% is going to be having any dent on the growth prospects.
What would be your comfort number, Dr. Subbarao? If say this year's fiscal deficit is 6.8 or 6.9%, and if she says that in 2023 we'll bring it down to 6.4 as the first step towards consolidation, would you buy that, or would you push for a number which is closer to 6% or even lower?
Well, not having the entire budget statistics in front of me, I'm unable to play with the numbers. But the important point is this, that the target she has set for herself is 4.5% by 25-26, which is 4 years from now. So whether you're going to take some relaxation up front and consolidate very rapidly in the later years, or even it out over a 4-year period, is a big decision to take. And my own choice would be towards spreading it out evenly over the 4 years. That's why I said earlier that she must opt for about between 6.5 to 6% this year, closer to 6%, and in fact go beyond that to give a path to consolidation over the next 4 years to reach 4.5% by 25-26.
The counter view to this, Subba, is that a lot of economists say, this fretting about the fiscal deficit is so yesterday's economics. Look at what countries are doing across the world. They're spending, they're printing money, they are basically focusing much more on growth and not obsessing about the fiscal deficit as much as they would have maybe even 4 or 5 years back. Is there sense in thinking like that, or do you think the perils of running large deficits are probably underappreciated?
Well, Udayan, I have great respect for people who say that we must look around the world and learn from that. Yes, of course. But international comparisons on fiscal deficit management are misleading. Every country must adopt its own fiscal stance and fiscal path depending on its debt profile, debt dynamics, balance of payments position, and repayment capacity. I've heard this version before that every other country is doing this, we must do this. But note this, that our debt to GDP ratio has galloped up quite rapidly and is going to hit about 90% of GDP this year. And interest payments, which are the largest single item of expenditure in the budget, are as much as 40% of revenues. And if interest payments are going to go up, where is the money for growth enhancing sectors like education, health and infrastructure? So to be growth supportive, I would think that it's important for India to consolidate, but consolidate gradually and while keeping borrowing at within reasonable limits, do expenditure restructuring. There can be a lot gained by shifting expenditure to growth enhancing sectors. So in summary, my view would be to stay within the fiscal path she has chosen, remain responsible, shift expenditure to growth enhancing sectors. I think that going with international comparisons will be misleading, if only because of our debt dynamics.
Okay. There's another aspect which I wanted to talk about before we come to the matter of debt, which is that in previous years when people spoke about being alarmed about rising levels of fiscal deficit, they would almost inevitably talk about rating agencies and what a dim view of such a move rating agencies globally would take and what that could mean for the country. But of late, over the last couple of years, there seems to be a lot of a dismissive attitude, almost of scorn about rating agencies. I mean, how do they matter? I mean, we don't need to kowtow to them or bow before their prerogatives. Do you think that's a myopic kind of a view to take?
I would think so. First of all, I want to say that we got to be fiscally responsible for our own sake, regardless of what rating agencies say. But second, to your specific question, I don't think we can disregard rating agencies altogether because they shape market perceptions. And as much as they shape market perceptions and as much as those market perceptions matter for the cost of our debt as well as for investor sentiment, I think we must pay heed to that. Now, I'm very fond of saying this, so let me say this, which is that in the run-up to the Asian crisis in the mid to late 90s, Australia, a rich country, and East Asian countries, which were emerging economies, had the same debt profile, had the same balance of payments issues. But the markets allowed Australia to make a smooth adjustment and avoid a crisis. Markets did not allow a similar facility to other East Asian economies and plunged them into a deep crisis. To say that market perceptions do not matter, to say that rating agencies can be completely ignored, I think will be a misleading view, and I think we should continue to pay some heed to that.
Okay. Now, you raised the issue of debt to GDP. It's an issue which is not often discussed in India quite with the same level of importance as maybe inflation or interest rates or fiscal deficit. But you know, state plus center almost nudging 90%, 40% of revenues is interest payments. Do you think we've already crossed a line? I mean, it's no longer enough to say that we're approaching danger levels. We probably already are at significantly dangerous levels with debt.
Well, I wouldn't be so alarmist to say that we've already crossed or we are at the danger level, but I would say that we must be very cautious about our debt to GDP limits, not just look at the fiscal deficit. Because the fiscal deficit is a flow variable, where the debt to GDP is a stock variable. And if you recall, Udayan, the FRBM committee 3 years ago said that we must do fiscal consolidation with the target being the debt to GDP ratio rather than the fiscal deficit, and I agree with that. So I believe that debt to GDP ratio has moved up rapidly over the last few years because of borrowing. I don't think it's alarmist at the moment. 90% is a high limit. We cannot afford it, so we must target about bringing it down. I think we should be targeting fiscal deficit, targeting revenue deficit, targeting primary deficit, but ultimately targeting debt to GDP levels. You know, there's another view. I just remembered over the last 2 years by this paper by Olivier Blanchard, which says that as long as the economy's growth rate is higher than the average interest on the debt, governments can pile up debt year on year without worrying about repayment capacity or debt explosion. I think that is valid only if your primary deficit is in surplus or in very small negative terms. But we have a very large primary deficit, so I think we are far away from being complacent about our debt levels.
Now back to the issue of growth, which is what people in the financial markets are more concerned with. What would you do in the finance minister's shoes today, looking at the uneven nature of the recovery that we are going through? Because one view is that do something which stokes investments, do something which creates jobs, because that is what is hurting. What would be your recipe of the kind of spending the finance ministry should do at this point to make the growth recovery more even?
Well, first of all, I want to say this, Udayan, which is that much of the government expenditure is non-discretionary. Whatever goes on salaries, pensions, interest payments, largely even subsidies and defense expenditure, these are largely non-negotiable. So the discretionary component available to the finance minister is quite limited, much as all the discussion in the market done by the analysts is about that. I want to highlight that the discretionary component is quite limited. So the finance minister has to make a decision on whether she must spend more on consumption or more on investment. I think she must make a generous commitment to Manrega, employment guarantee, because that is self-targeting, and also make a commitment that she will top it up if necessary. But beyond that, I think the focus should be on investment expenditure, because that supports growth not only in the short term but provides the growth base for future years. So I think consumption support is important, but given the fiscal constraint, limit support, livelihood support, to a generous allocation for Manrega, and then allocate as much as is possible for investment, public investment, like she did last year. And I also want to say this, which is that typically capital expenditure, investment expenditure is short of allocation. I don't know how we're performing this year, but I've seen some reports that it is short of allocation. So I think the finance ministry and the government must also have a business continuity program, which is to ensure that capital expenditure keeps on track and actually we're able to spend the allocated amount.
You know, you spoke about Manrega, Subba, but there is a view that, maybe something like the Manrega should be done for the urban population as well. I mean, some version of an urban safety net or some kind of a minimum job guarantee. Do you think there's a case for that? Because that would require a substantial outlay in the budget. Given that poverty, the growth in poverty is not just a rural phenomenon, do you think there's a case for something like this?
Well, if there are no fiscal constraints, there's a case. But given there are fiscal constraints, and given that urban employment guarantee is going to cost much, much more because urban wages are high, I would think that it's fiscally very, very difficult to implement. But there's also another deeper issue, which is that one of our longer objectives, growth objectives beyond the budget, should be to arrest this rural-urban migration. So if we have an urban employment guarantee program, it's quite possible that we will have a paradoxical or a unintended consequence of actually encouraging rural-urban migration. So as much as there is a persuasive case for urban employment guarantee program, given the fiscal constraints, as also the importance of arresting rural migration and providing sustainable employment to rural labor within rural or semi-rural areas, I would think that it might be infeasible and unaffordable at this time.
Now, the other elephant in the room, of course, not just in India but globally, is inflation. Now, all that we've discussed over the last few minutes, what implications does it have to inflation for the rest of 2022? Because that seems to be the biggest problem in the Western world today. And while we are not yet panicking about it in India, there is a growing view that the central bank might be falling a little bit behind the curve there. How do you see the issue of inflation globally and in India?
Well, first let's look at the inflation situation in India. Over the last 2 years, there has been significant monetary and fiscal expansion, and for right reasons. But now looking at the domestic situation and the global situation, we must see how our policy should evolve. Looking at inflation at home here, average inflation has been in the upper bands of the inflation target, close to around 6% for the last 2 years. Inflation expectations have hardened by about 200 basis points. Core inflation momentum is strong. Current account, which was in surplus last year, is going to turn into deficit. These are not alarming levels, but certainly there's going to be a flipping from a surplus to deficit. So inflation management is going to be a problem, I believe, should be a present concern, if also because inflation is a regressive tax. It hurts poor people most. So as much as you want to support poor people who've been distressed by the pandemic, I think bringing down inflation is important. On the fiscal side, yes, to some extent, fiscal expansion contributes to inflation if it is not contributing to production directly. For example, if there is direct consumption support, that could contribute to inflation. So the first point I want to make is that unlike 2 years ago or even unlike last year, inflation management should receive the attention of the Reserve Bank. It's not that it's not been receiving, but should take priority of the Reserve Bank as well as of the government. You also asked about the international situation. Of course, there is a bit of imported, not a bit, but there is significant imported inflation through commodity prices which have hardened, especially price of crude, which is, I believe, around $85 to $87. So that's going to put pressure on prices. All the output prices which have been absorbed so far by producers, I don't think they're going to absorb it anymore. They're going to pass it on through consumer prices. So there's going to be upward pressure on inflation. And I believe that it's now time for RBI to be reassessing their balance between supporting growth and controlling inflation.
Is there enough time, Subba, now to deliberate all these issues? Because some people have already pulled the trigger. I mean, the United States, which is the most shy of rocking financial markets with interest rate increases, is already signaling it. Many other economies, large economies like Brazil, have already been raising interest rates for a while now. We are still contemplating whether we should be doing it. Is there a risk in your eyes that we may come to this a little late and maybe even fall behind the curve? Because that's always something which every central banker worries about.
Well, I don't think we are behind the curve now at the moment, so let me say that up front. It's quite possible that we'll fall behind the curve if we don't act, in reasonable time. But I would say that international comparisons are misleading, because if you look at the rich world, the US, UK, and Europe, they've had negative inflation, extremely low inflation since the global financial crisis. So suddenly over the last 1 year, it's shot up for them. So it's just not the current rate of inflation, but its trajectory that you must see. Whereas in our case, inflation has been around 4 to 5% after I left the Reserve Bank. It's come down, and after we adopted the inflation targeting framework, it's been around 4 to 5%, and gradually it's moved up to 6%. So as much as I would say that the RBI must shift attention or must reassess its balance between supporting growth and reining in inflation, I don't believe we are already behind the curve.
Now to a slightly unrelated issue, Subba, which is that in the budget session there was an expectation, and now that expectation is waning a bit, that we'll have the cryptocurrency bill coming out. I mean, as a former central bank governor, you must have watched this whole explosion of interest in cryptocurrencies quite with great interest. What is your suggestion to the government of dealing with the cryptocurrency issue in terms of how the laws should be framed, how taxation of cryptocurrency should be framed, and whether even if it's not legal tender, we should allow it to be an investment or an asset class?
Well, there's been a lot of debate around it over the last several months, triggered obviously by the enormous amount of investment that's gone into cryptocurrencies. Certainly, I think there is need for government to come out with a law with their stance on what they want to do with it. I think inaction is inappropriate any further. So soon enough, the government must come out with some view on where they stand with their policy, whether they come out with a law or whether they're going to come out with some regulation. International experience will be helpful in this regard. Around the world, there have been three routes taken to cryptocurrencies. The first is passive tolerance, which is not recognize cryptocurrencies as official legal tender, but allow it to allow people to invest in it, like the Reserve Bank did last year, which is to say that we will not allow our regulated institutions to deal with cryptocurrencies, but otherwise we will not recognize this as legal tender, but otherwise people can do what they want. Supreme Court struck it down. So the passive tolerance option is not there. The other option is complete ban. I am against a complete ban, if only because it will be difficult to implement and will push the trade into invisible and illegal channels. So I think the middle path would be for the government to say that this will not be legal tender. We're going to regulate this as an asset class, and I believe come up with appropriate law or regulation to be consistent with that policy.
Subba, it's a pleasure talking to you as always and to hear your clarity of thought. Thank you very much for taking time out for this show today. Thank you.
Thank you, Udayan. Thanks very much.